Back to the scene, I would like to draw your attention on the jitter option under the sample option section, which, as you can see from the tooltip, reduces regular sampling pattern artifacts. Usually I keep this option always enabled in my projects. Let's check again the ray tracing section, and as you will notice, since this is a very heavy scene, much more heavy than the scene of the classroom scene. Before I told you that I used to double the default value of 1, 1 and 2, which are set here. Usually is 1 for the reflection, 1 for refraction, and 2 for the max trace depth. In this case I go further and I increase to 4. I multiply by 4. And let's see from the Maya Online Help the correct description. Better than mine for sure. So let's see. Ray tracing. So under the select ray tracing as the secondary renderer, so let's say the secondary rays, okay? So that when the primary render, scanline, rasterizer, or ray tracing detects that refraction or reflections are needed, it will switch to ray tracing only mode, which is that one that I suggest you to use in Maya 2011 always. Ray tracing can produce the most physically accurate refraction, shadows, global illumination, caustics, and final gather. Let's scroll down a little bit more and let's see. Under the reflections, reflection are the maximum number of times a ray can be reflected or off reflective surfaces. Maya performs unlimited transparencies but limited refraction. Refraction limit do not control transparency limit. The rasterizer has a special transparency control to either limit or expand the transparency level. This is particularly useful for sprite and hair and FUR render. As I told you before, the rasterizer to use with FUR and motion blur. Let's scroll down a little bit more, and refraction, the maximum number of times a ray can be refracted through a non-opaque surface, means a transparent surface with a glass material, emitter ray material shader applied. If refraction turns black, make sure that the refraction is set to a high enough value. For this very reason I input 4 on a very heavy scene like mine. Now down to the max trace depth of input. While the reflection settings and refraction setting each set the maximum number of times a ray can reflect or refract respectively, this setting sets the total number of penetration that can occur regardless of whether the penetration is a result of reflection or refraction. For example, if reflection is 5 and refraction is 5, but max depth trace is 4, then any combination of reflection and refraction bounces can take place up to a maximum number of 4. 4 is the limit, so it sets a limit to 4. Here there is a tip. Let's say the max trace depth attribute applies only to refraction and not to transparency. Transparency is unlimited while refraction is limited by the max trace depth. When ray tracing is turned off, refractions become transparency and the max trace depth is not applicable. Now for the shadows settings, I just will read for you this. The maximum number of times a shadow ray will penetrate a transparent or refracting object, like glass, like a glass bottle or such. So, for this reason that in the Maya scene, I increase to 4 to make sure that it will penetrate, the shadow will penetrate the transparent object in my scene. Now back to the acceleration section one more time, and I will not repeat the concept of before. I just want to let you know about the acceleration method First, that BSP stands for binary space partitioning, and the important part that I would like to explain to you is that before Maya 2011, when I was still using Maya 2009, since I always work with very heavy scenes, like this one, 200 megabyte or even more, I use this input, mean the acceleration method. I always use the regular BSP because the BSP2 was unstable and buggy, keep crashing, mental ray keep crashing on rendering. So I always use regular BSP in conjunction with the primary render scanline option. This is how I used before that Maya. This is how I used mental ray before Maya 2011 came out. So let's input back this, and let's open the Maya online help one more time. We are nearly done. It's not will not take much longer. As you can see, this is the term for the BSP, binary space partitioning acceleration method. Recursively subdivides 3D space into a nested set of voxels, small boxes with the triangles in them. This is an algorithm. It's very difficult concept. Anyway, it is efficient but careful attention should be given to the size and depth parameters, which can have a large impact on speed and memory usage. I will not go through the description of the large that now is not much used anymore, the large BSP mode. Before was used for large scenes like that one that I usually use before Maya 2011 came out. But now, since BSP2 is fixed, it defaults to BSP2 acceleration method now. And let's see the settings in the Maya scene. As you can see, let's scroll down a little bit. As you can see, BSP, when you input the regular BSP like I used to input before Maya 2011, the two fields BSP size and BSP depth was you can input your own parameter, okay, your own values. But now when you enable BSP2, you cannot anymore put your own values, and this is good because before there was a trick that you must increase or decrease. It's difficult to explain anyway, it was quite tricky, and it affects very much the rendering speed. So let's put BSP2 and render. Don't need anymore to input values. And let's scroll down a little bit more. To speed up the presentation, I will just stop on the main, on the important settings. Okay, here under the shadow, if you open the drop-down menu, you will see a few options. Simple, sorted, and segments. Segments is the more neat option for me. It's the method of shadow detecting and shadow calling. Segments for my scenes works the best. You can also use a simple, but in my case I suggest you to go to segments, okay? Scroll down again, shadow maps, motion blur, we don't use. Motion offset, nothing, we don't need. Let's scroll down to the frame buffer section. Before I told you that when you open a fresh scene, it defaults the frame buffer data type, it defaults to the RGBA byte 4x8 bit. RGBA stands for red, green and blue, and A stands for alpha. And since we are using OpenEXR format from ILM, you should input the RGBA for float 4x32-bit option in the frame buffer data type. The gamma I will not explain to you now, because before we also used the gamma to tone mapping the image when using 32-bit floating image, but I prefer to use other workflows, example the new color management for tone mapping the image, and later I will show you what tone mapping actually is. So I think for this the quality tab is enough. But before to close the description of the settings under the quality tab, I would like to open one more time the online help and check what the frame buffer output, the primary frame buffer output actually is. I will not read all the information, just this. It selects, means the data type option selects the kind of information that the main frame buffer contains. Means when you're using multi-render passes, mental ray render passes, this is actually the master beauty pass frame buffer settings, okay? This is important. Gamma we will skip because now there is the new color management feature. And let's give a quick look to the color clip settings. It controls how colors are clipped into a valid range between 0 and 1 before being written to a non-floating point frame buffer or file. In all modes, the RGB component are clipped as specified by the desaturate option. The RGB and alpha modes ensure that the resulting color is a valid premultiplied color. Later we will check what is the premultiplied option. Clipping occurs only in 8-bit integer and 16-bit integer frame buffers. If you are using float, like we are using now, 32-bit float point image, and half for float, which is 16-bit in depth, no clipping occurs. So briefly, just to explain to you what these options are, they suggest that if you choose the RGB option under the color clip section, use RGB if the alpha channel is considered less important than preserving the RGB color and intensity values. Alpha mode is intended for alpha compositing, means when alpha is important you should use this mode, but since we are using the 32-bit floating point image output, these three options are not really important, so I leave it always to the raw default. Here they say that use raw mode only if no layering based on alpha is going to take place. This mode turns premultiply on, so use it with care because shaders might receive colors that cannot be composite in standard ways. Honestly, I never use the other option. I always go with the default, so then it's really up to you. Depend if you have to go in post printing, these kind of things. Now a quick look to the other few options, and here there is the premultiply option, which is important. I would like to read for you. If this option is on by default, premultiplication takes place. If on, mental ray for Maya renders objects so that they are not anti-aliased against the background. For example, a pixel on the edge of an object is not mixed with the background color. The premultiply off option instructs mental ray to always store colors unpremultiplied into frame buffers and files. When this option is off, mental ray does not premultiply the textures or the output frame buffer. This option is ignored if the color clip raw mode is in effect. So in our case, there is no premultiply option because we choose means I always go with the raw option. Now down to the deter option, and the deter actually is just a smoothing effect, which I always enable in my files, in my scenes, because it smooths the pixel by introducing noise into the pixel such that the round off errors are even out. Let's say that smooth the pixel and mix them together, and this means I always keep it enabled. This is for my workflow. Now the last option that I would like to draw your attention to is an important one, because it's the contrast all buffers. must to be used in conjunction with the multi-render passes features. When you have render passes, now I open Maya, is the last option, as you can see, this one. I always keep this enabled, and from the tooltip you can see if set the contrast oversampling test is done based on all color buffers, including user frame buffers. Actually, by keeping enabled the contrast all buffer option, you make sure that you will avoid aliasing artifacts in the render passes, in the mental ray render passes, like for example zeta depth or ambient occlusion, because if you don't enable this option, you can find you can have aliasing artifacts in the mental ray render passes feature. Now we will check under the indirect lighting tab all the settings and features. As you can see, this is a production scene, and there is the physical sun and sky. If you want, I can show you. One second that I reduce a few windows. And this is the Mia physical sky. As you can see, these are the various settings, multiplier 1. I will not go through all of this. You can find all the documentation under the mental ray section of the online documents. And let's see the sun direction tab. This is the main sun, which is a directional light. Let's explore briefly the option without to go in depth on the description. Let's scroll down here. You see I enable the emit photons, which somebody suggests you can avoid, but I always keep this enabled to make sure that the photons will be calculated by the global illumination feature, mental ray feature. Okay, shadows, other things. And go to the Mia physical sun. Here are all the parameters. And just I will show you this. Photon bounding box minimum values, x, y, z. Of course, these are the field for the x, for the y, and the z dimensions. Okay, and here is the photon bounding box max for the x, y, z again. I always input these values in my production scenes because I want to make sure that global illumination will calculate only the area that surrounds the scene and not a larger area, just to keep the rendering faster and the global illumination solution neat. Back to the main render setting panel. Let's scroll down under the global illumination section, which is enabled. I would like to show you that when you enable these features, means global illumination, caustics, and final gathering, importance, and irradiant particles, under the feature tab here, automatically they are enabled under the indirect lighting tab as well. For global illumination, usually I don't change any more values. Before the Maya 2011 version, I used to increase the accuracy and I give a radius so that the global illumination solution can compute a correct size, like I showed you before for the bounding box option. And let's go down. Usually photo tracing, I use the default values, as you can see. I leave it to 5. Let's scroll down more. Accuracy of the photon volume, I don't change anything. Here, importance, I suggest you to check my previous tutorial at Gnomon, and you will see all the what are these options and why I use them and which value must to be used. Here there is a long tooltip. Anyway, let's scroll down. We will skip this section. I would like to show you my settings. These are my production settings. Actually are not mine. This comes from Matteo Magnazzi, Dagon, which is a kind of mentor for me, and is the very stable settings for the final gathering solution. And as you can see, I always input 250 for the accuracy. Let's bring up the tooltip. Number of rays per final gather point cast into the hemisphere to estimate incident global illumination. Higher values raise the accuracy of the result, which is expensive. Point density is a setting that doesn't affect much the... Actually, it affects, sorry, it is very expensive. More you increase, more become expensive. Means when we say expensive, it means that is more, the render will take long time. Okay, this is the inexpensive option, which is the point interpolation. The number of final gather points to be considered for interpolation at a shading sample during rendering. Higher values smooth the final gathering result at little cost of rendering time. Let's go down and check the secondary diffuse bounces. This is important because before look at the tooltip. Render global illumination effects with final gathering. Actually, the secondary diffuse bounces I usually use the value 4. I increase to the value 4. Let's say the global illumination, the photon will bounce more in this is used mostly for interior, but can use also for exteriors, to make the light bounce more times, and usually the color of the reflection increases. It's difficult to explain, it's very virtual concept. Anyway, it makes the the global illumination solution, which is used together with the final gathering solution, there's more luminosity in the scene. The scenes are more bright, and the reflections, colors are more intense, which I actually like. I hope that my explanation was correct. Let's check from the online documents. Okay, let's check. For final gathering, they say use this to turn on final gathering for global illumination on or off. The default is off. I always use on. Final gathering is a different means of calculating indirect illumination, which are the secondary rays. You remember before we speak about primary rays and secondary rays. And okay, I will not tell you all the settings, what they control. Let's go direct to the secondary diffuse bounces. Here there's also what actually happened. So use this attribute to set multiple diffuse bounces for final gathering. This option controls whether indirect diffuse lighting contributes to final gather, up to a sum of the final gather reflection and final gather refraction values. Use this attribute to add more light and color bleeding. This is what I would like to explain you before. Means it increase the color bleeding, which is the color that, as you can see here from this sphere, now there is more red on the plane where this let's call it donut lies. Means the light of the object is reflected on the neighboring objects. Okay, and this we call color bleeding. Also use this option to prevent unnatural darkening of corners in your scene. The higher the value, the longer the final gather computation process takes.